There are moments in life that split you into two people: the person you were before and the person you become after. For me, it happened on an ordinary morning. No warning, no argument, no dramatic goodbye, just absence. Let me ask you something before I go any further. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you never imagined they could destroy your life? And tell me in the comments while you're listening, where are you watching from today? Because stories like this happen everywhere, but they feel loneliest when you're living inside one. I was married to a Caribbean American man, charismatic, confident, the kind of man who knew how to speak softly in public and rule harshly in private. At first, people admired us. They didn't see the control. They didn't hear the insults disguised as jokes. They didn't notice how my world kept getting smaller while his grew larger. I learned early how to endure. I learned how to stay quiet when correcting him caused explosions, how to apologize even when I didn't understand what I'd done wrong, how to swallow my voice to keep the peace. Endurance became my survival language. We had a son, 6 years old, bright, curious, gentle. And for a while, I believed motherhood would soften him. It didn't. The emotional neglect turned into financial control. The criticism became humiliation. He decided when I spoke, when I rested, when I mattered. And then one day, he decided to leave. Except he didn't just leave me. He took our child. No custody discussion. No legal warning. No goodbye. He told me he was taking our son on a short trip to see family. I watched them walk out the door. I didn't know it was the last time I'd see my child in years. By the time I realized something was wrong, they were already gone. Out of the country, out of reach, out of my life. He relocated permanently to Jamaica, and he never came back. The day I realized he wasn't coming back wasn't dramatic. There was no phone call, no announcement, no final argument, just a growing silence that stretched beyond reason. At first, I told myself he needed time, that maybe he was overwhelmed, that maybe distance would cool whatever anger had been simmering beneath the surface for years. That's what abuse teaches you. To excuse what shouldn't be excused. I replayed conversations in my head, searching for the moment where I could have prevented this. The tone of my voice, the words I chose, the days I didn't stay quiet enough. Do you know how dangerous it is to believe someone's cruelty is your responsibility? I started calling, texting, emailing, nothing. When he finally responded, it was brief and calculated. He told me I was overreacting. He said our son was fine. He told me I should focus on myself. As if motherhood were a hobby I could pause. That's when I understood something terrifying. He didn't just take my child. He erased me as a mother. He told people his version of the story, that I was unstable, difficult, emotional. He used the same words he had always used when he wanted to control the narrative, and people believed him. Because confidence sounds like truth when pain makes you quiet. I contacted lawyers, family court, authorities, and that's when the second betrayal began. The system didn't move for grief. They spoke in policies, jurisdiction, international complications. They explained to me gently that once a child crosses borders, time becomes the enemy. Time. The same thing I didn't have. Every step cost money. Every consultation reminded me that justice has a price tag. And it's not always affordable to mothers left behind. I worked during the day and cried at night. I filled out forms with shaking hands. I told my story so many times it started to sound like someone else's life. And in between all of it, I went home to a house that still smelled like my child. Shoes by the door, drawings on the fridge, a toothbrush untouched. People asked me how I was holding up. I learned how to lie because the truth made people uncomfortable. Let me ask you something. If you lost someone this way,
Would you even know how to explain it? People talk about time as if it's gentle, as if it comes in with soft hands and slowly carries your pain away. That wasn't my experience. Time didn't heal me. Time tested me. The first year after he vanished with my child felt unreal, like I was living someone else's life, moving through days that didn't belong to me. I woke up every morning with a split second of forgetting. And then the truth rushed back in like cold water. He's gone. My child is gone. And I'm still here. By the second year, shock had worn off. That's when the real suffering began. Because shock protects you. Reality doesn't. Reality is waking up knowing nothing is going to change today. Reality is realizing there will be no phone call, no sudden knock at the door, no explanation that makes it all make sense. I learned how to carry grief the way people carry chronic pain, quietly, invisibly, constantly. I stopped talking about my son the way I used to, not because I stopped loving him, but because saying his name out loud cracked something open in me that I couldn't always afford to break. People would ask, "How's your son doing?" And I'd freeze, because there is no socially acceptable answer to that question when your child has been taken from you and the world expects you to keep functioning. I learned how to deflect. He's okay. He's growing. Words that sounded normal but felt like lies scraped from the surface of my throat. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had to pretend something wasn't killing you just so other people could stay comfortable? Years passed. I marked time by absence, another birthday without him, another school year I didn't. Witness another holiday where his place at the table stayed empty. I bought gifts I couldn't send, wrote letters I couldn't deliver, spoke to him in my thoughts because that was the only place he still belonged to me. At night, I replayed memories like they were fragile heirlooms. The way his hand fit into mine, the sound of his laugh, the way he said "mom" like it was the safest word he knew. I was terrified of forgetting, not forgetting him, but forgetting the details. So I held on to them fiercely even when it hurt. Eventually, something inside me changed. The pain stopped being sharp. It became heavy. It settled into my body. I grew tired in ways sleep couldn't fix. I noticed it in my face. The seriousness, the restraint, the way my eyes no longer searched rooms for joy. I became quieter, not sad, contained. People mistook that for strength. They'd say, "I don't know how you do it." And I wanted to tell them, I don't have a choice. Survival doesn't feel brave when it's your only option. There were moments I blamed myself, moments when I wondered if enduring the maltreatment had somehow taught him I would always endure anything, if staying too long had cost me everything. Self-blame is a cruel companion. It whispers that if you had just been smarter, quieter, faster, this wouldn't have happened. But slowly, painfully, I learned something important. Being abused does not make you responsible for the abuse. Being abandoned does not mean you failed. Being left behind does not mean you were unworthy of staying. That realization didn't bring relief, it brought grief, because it meant I had been powerless, and powerlessness is hard to accept. Somewhere in those years, numbness arrived, not all at once, piece by piece. I stopped crying the way I used to. Tears became rare, inefficient. Pain no longer announced itself. It lived under my skin. I functioned, went to work, paid bills, smiled when expected. I became very good at being fine. But inside, everything was muted. Joy didn't last. Sadness didn't release. Everything existed in the same dull register. I wondered if this was just who I was now. A woman shaped by loss. Then one day, without warning, I realized I was still here, still breathing, still choosing not to disappear. And that mattered. I began rebuilding my identity slowly, carefully, not as someone's wife, not as a mother with visible proof, but as a woman who had endured something unspeakable and didn't let it turn her cruel. I found purpose in small things, routine, structure, quiet service, helping others without telling my story, because sometimes your survival becomes someone else's permission to keep going. Let me ask you, if everything you loved was taken from you, who would you become just to stay alive? I didn't stop loving my child. That never changed. But I learned how to love him without destroying myself. I loved him in prayers, in hope without expectation, in the decision to keep my heart open even when it would have been easier to harden it. Years passed, and though the wound never closed, it stopped bleeding. Not because it healed, but because I learned how to live around it. And that might be the most honest definition of endurance I know. There is a particular kind of pain that comes when you realize answers are not coming. Not later, not eventually, not if you wait just a little longer. They are simply not coming. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, disguising itself as patience at first. I told myself, give it time. People resurface, circumstances change, but time kept moving and silence stayed exactly where it was. No messages, no legal cooperation, no acknowledgement of what had been done. Just a man living his life somewhere else, carrying my child with him while I stood still, anchored to a moment that never resolved. At some point, I had to face a truth that felt almost unbearable. I might never hear his explanation. I might never know what my child was told about me. I might never get the chance to correct the story. That's when grief changed again. It stopped being about loss and became about injustice, because loss suggests something accidental. This was deliberate. I wrestled with anger for a long time. Not the loud kind, the quiet, simmering kind that sits behind your ribs and flares when you least expect it. I felt it when people complained about trivial things, when I saw mothers walking with sons my child's age, when I heard people say, everything happens for a reason. I wanted to ask them, whose reason? What reason justifies a mother living the rest of her life without her child's voice? But anger, like grief, gets heavy when you carry it too long. And I was already tired. I realized something painful. Holding on to rage didn't hurt him. It was eroding me. So I began the hardest work of all, not forgiveness, but acceptance. Acceptance is often misunderstood. People think it means agreement. It doesn't. Acceptance means acknowledging reality without continuing to argue with it. And reality was this: he chose to disappear. He chose silence. He chose not to repair the damage. And no amount of waiting would change that. I stopped checking international numbers, stopped searching for updates, stopped imagining conversations that would never happen. Not because I didn't care, but because caring had started to cost me my sanity. Let me ask you something. How long could you live waiting for an explanation that may never come? I began setting boundaries with my own memories. That was new. Before I revisited the past compulsively, replaying moments, searching for clues, punishing myself for not seeing what was coming. Now I limited those visits. I let myself remember, but not ruminate. I told myself, you are allowed to stop reopening wounds just to prove they existed. That shift didn't bring happiness, but it brought stability, and stability is underrated when you've lived in emotional chaos for years. I also had to accept something even harder. My child was growing up without me. That sentence took years to fully land. I imagined milestones I would never witness, lessons I wouldn't teach, comfort I wouldn't give. I grieved the mother I thought I would be. And then, slowly, I redefined motherhood. I realized motherhood isn't erased by distance, it becomes internal. I mothered my child in prayer, in the way I treated others' children, in the way I refused to let cruelty reshape me. I chose to live in a way that if my child ever looked back, he would find integrity instead of bitterness. That mattered. I also stopped defending myself to people who didn't understand. I learned that some people don't have the emotional capacity to sit with unresolved loss, and that's okay. Not everyone is meant to carry this story with me. I became selective with my energy, quiet, grounded, intentional. And something unexpected happened. Peace began to appear in small places, not joy, peace. In mornings that felt steady, in evenings that didn't end in tears, in moments where my life felt like it belonged to me again. Peace didn't mean I forgot. It meant I stopped letting absence dominate every thought. Let me ask you, what would your life look like if you stopped waiting for answers and started choosing peace instead? I don't know where my child is now. I don't know what he's been told. That uncertainty will always live with me, but it no longer defines me. I am not frozen in the moment he left. I am still moving, still growing, still choosing to live with dignity. And that, after everything, feels like a quiet kind of victory. There comes a moment, and no one tells you when survival stops being about enduring pain and starts being about deciding how you will live with it. That moment didn't arrive with clarity or relief. It arrived with exhaustion. I was tired of waking up already bracing myself, tired of measuring every day against what was missing, tired of carrying a story that had no ending. I realized something important. Waiting had become its own form of suffering. Not waiting for my child, because a mother never stops holding space for that, but waiting for life to begin again. And life doesn't restart on its own. You have to choose it. That choice felt almost disloyal at first. How do you keep living when the most important part of your heart exists somewhere you can't reach? How do you build joy when grief never fully leaves? Those questions haunted me. But slowly I learned that choosing life wasn't abandonment, it was preservation. I began to allow myself small permissions. Permission to laugh without guilt. Permission to enjoy moments without immediately apologizing to my grief. Permission to imagine a future that didn't revolve around waiting. Those permissions didn't erase the pain, they made space around it. I stopped defining my days by what I had lost and started anchoring them in what I could still protect: my health, my integrity, my peace. I became intentional about how I spent my energy. I no longer entertained conversations that minimized my experience. I stopped explaining myself to people who needed a simple story to feel comfortable. Some losses don't fit neatly into conversation. That doesn't make them less real. I also learned to live with the quiet presence of my child, not as absence, but as memory. I carried him in the way I showed up for others, in the patience I extended, in the compassion I practiced, even when bitterness would have been easier. I wanted to live in a way that honored him, not by being consumed by sorrow, but by refusing to let cruelty be the loudest thing my story produced. I thought often about the kind of woman I wanted my child to remember me as, if memory ever found its way back, not broken, not bitter, not erased, but steady, dignified, whole. There were still hard days, days when I imagined him somewhere far away, growing older without my voice to guide him. Days when grief returned suddenly, without warning, and sat beside me like an old companion. I stopped fighting those moments. I let them come. I learned that strength doesn't mean constant composure. It means allowing pain to pass through you without letting it define who you become. Over time, my life grew fuller. Not louder, fuller, richer in quiet ways. I cultivated routines that grounded me, relationships that felt safe, solitude that didn't feel lonely. I stopped asking myself when things would make sense. I started asking myself how I wanted to live regardless. Let me ask you something. If your story never resolved the way you hoped, would you still give yourself permission to live fully? Because that is the question no one prepares you for. We're taught to wait for closure, but some lives require courage without it. I don't know if my child will ever search for me. I don't know if truth will reach him in the right language at the right time. But I know this. If that day ever comes, I want him to meet a woman who survived without shrinking, a woman who endured loss without becoming unkind, a woman who chose peace not because the world was fair, but because she deserved it. This story doesn't end with justice, it ends with choice. The choice to remain human, the choice to live honestly, the choice to keep my heart open in a world that gave me every reason to close it. If you're watching this, especially if you're older, if you've lived long enough to understand that some wounds don't heal, but they do soften, I want you to tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?
And what helped you keep going when answers never came? Some people vanish from our lives, but we don't have to vanish with them. And that quietly, steadily, is how I kept living.